Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitics in historical context with myself, Ali Ansari, and my co-host, Suzanne Rain. Today, it gives us great pleasure to welcome Jade McGlynn, who is from currently at the Middlebury Institute of International Relations and has been working on Russia and Russia's war. You've got a book coming out, I think, Jade, soon on Russia's war, and also have another book. Actually, you're very productive. You've got two books coming out this summer, one on memory makers and the other on Russia's war. And we want to talk to you today really about this idea of whether it is, as Suzanne was saying earlier, whether it is actually Russia's war or is it Putin's war. Suzanne, did you want to take that on?
So, Ali, that was my question. That
I know, which I've just posed. Yeah.
But, Jade, we're delighted to have you with us because I think ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in February this year, there's been some confusion and debate in certainly Western commentary about whether to say this is Putin's war, whether this is Russia's war. And of course, at the heart of that is the issue that you've done all your research on, which is essentially what is Russia, and is it one man or is it a collective decision? Is it collective? So you've called your book Russia's War. Is that you saying what you think the answer to that is?
Yes, 100%. That's exactly what it is. I think that, and thank you for having me on. Sorry, before I launch straight into the sort of the meat of it, but I think I understand why many Western policymakers, why many Westerners even, and also why many Russian liberals who are opposed to the regime would want to paint this just as Putin's war. And I think, the notion that Putin invaded Ukraine despite the Russian people and that it's just sort of one bad Tsar sort of spoiling the barrel. And once he dies, once his generation perhaps has died out, then the Russian people will sort of trot merrily onto this path of progress with a liberal youth who admire and envy the West. I completely understand the appeal of this narrative. And I even understand the sort of why it might work as a policy, but it has the huge disadvantage of being untrue. Russia's war on Ukraine is popular with a large number of Russians, and it's acceptable to an even larger number. And I think that's something that needs to be understood, because a lot of the time in discussions, people just want they think, if we can just get rid of Putin, or if only the Russians knew what was happening in this war. But I mean, very broadly, they know, and very broadly, they support it. I'm not talking about specific things here, or maybe support isn't the right word, but they approve or they're willing to accept it.
So the thing that we're going to get into is how and why they approve and are willing to accept it. And so that sense how a kind of shared identity is created. And on the one hand, I suppose you've got an argument which says it's very difficult to be an oppositionist in Russia. So it'd be really interesting to sort of hear your views on whether there is an opposition to the war in Russia and whether the opposition to the war in Russia is synonymous with the opposition in Russia. Actually, can we start with that question? Because actually, I don't think the two, if there's a Venn diagram, I think it's only a bit in the middle, isn't it? Which is opposition to Putin, who's also opposed to the war. I think Navalny said a number of things which have been very anti-Ukrainian. What's your view on that?
So Navalny, for example, he's been very, very clear that he's against the war. And in any case, I feel, I sort of feel like poor Navalny should be left in peace about his views on Crimea. He's got enough on his plate. So I'd like to speak more generally about the opposition, but just to clarify, Navalny has been very, very clear that he is against this war and has made some brave statements from prison about that. I do think, though, that more broadly, you hit upon an interesting point, which is that so sometimes I find the question, okay, do Russians support the war? Of course, it's interesting, but I think the more interesting question is why do Russians support the war, or why do Russians not support the war? In this case, in answer to your question. And a lot of the time, the reason that they don't support the war is often for reasons that essentially revolve around Russians and the language around the war in certain sections of Russian liberals. They're quite inchoate, they're quite they find it hard to get along, which is part of the issue over many years. But is that they don't really center the Ukrainian experience. And you've seen some quite nasty sort of comments from leading oppositioners to Ukrainians. And they've often been annoyed or sort of compared the way that Ukrainians are talking about Russians, to Putin, which is obviously completely unacceptable, because essentially Ukrainians are going to say a lot of things about Russians, but they're not the ones sort of waging a war against Russia. It's Russia waging a war against them. And I think there's this kind of this introspection and this self-obsession. I have a statistic from the book, which is that I looked at the social media channels, And I looked at Navalny's channel, which of course isn't run by Navalny these days, but by his team. And if the average number of references to Ukraine in pro-war channels, in pro-war sort of social media channels, was about 1,200, then on Navalny's channel, it was 18. So in discussions of the war, Ukraine just isn't mentioned, or it's very rarely mentioned among Russian liberals. And I think that's fascinating because it talks to how there are much longer kind of ways of seeing the world and ways of seeing Russia, and that actually penetrate into both those who are for Putin, but also those who are against him.
Does it also indicate that they're thinking quite rationally that setting an opposition cause alongside an anti-war in Ukraine cause potentially undermines their appeal to large parts of the Russian population who support
exactly.
the war?
No, I think they're both. I think that they're both correct though, because they both lead us back to the point of, okay, so then this war is either quite popular or there's a sunken costs fallacy going on where so many people have died that now it means a lot to people and they're going to need to get something from it. Either way, essentially any future democratic, and I find it very hard to see how Russia in the short to medium term gets onto a democratic path, but any future democratic path without a huge kind of shift in what we'll for shorthand call the Russian worldview, it will be supportive of this war, or at least of similar wars, and it doesn't really solve the problem for Russia's neighbours, or indeed for Russia, because this is money that should be spent on developing Russia.
I mean, one of the things I wanted to sort of like ask you is to what extent this how it's been constructed. I mean, how the sort of the popular support for the war or for any sort of aggressive posture really to its near abroad. I mean, presumably this is a project that the elite, if you will, I mean, have been building on over the last, 2 decades? Or, I mean, how long, or is this, are you saying this is something actually, much deeper in the Russian psychology or something? I mean, they're obviously building on something, I take it, but nonetheless, they must have put quite a bit of effort into to also constructing a sort of a narrative of grievance, a narrative of, what it is to be Russian and why it's, why everyone should be supporting this war.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that mix, as you're saying, Ali. So really, I would say the kind of the turning point, or the important turning point for this, is 2012 and Putin's third term.
Right.
When President Trump, when he came back after, if you remember, after Medvedev had his little run being president. And we saw a real shift in the language there, in terms of a real shift towards a sort of more civilizational discourse, I suppose, around what it means to be Russia, the idea of Russia as a great power, the idea is Russia as sort of not having a Western path, and even kind of almost Russia playing this sort of counter-revolutionary role in the world. And then with the 2014 Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, which ousted the pro-Russian then President Viktor Yanukovych, in the sense that he fled once he lost the support of his security services. A lot of the narratives that we see today justifying the war on Ukraine, they didn't start then, but they really became quite intense then. And that's actually how I became interested in this very topic, because I've been analysing it since then, because I lived in Moscow in 2014 and I was sort of watching this on the news every day, and I found it, I mean, obviously I found it horrifying, but I also found it quite fascinating. And so I've been sort of studying it ever since, the way they've created these narratives, and also, and this was a topic of my PhD, to what extent these narratives resonate with people. And as a sort of overview, what I would say is the Kremlin and sort of media that is pro-Kremlin, they choose these narratives because they resonate. And often what you will find is these narratives may have come up organically, or there could be initiatives, for example, that are organic, that the Kremlin will then take over, but will try and do so in a way where it's not clear that the Kremlin has taken it over. So it tries very hard to sort of, it's not like the Soviet Union where everything's sort of top down and you have this party line. It's I would say it's cleverer than that. Although, I mean, whenever they try to do something that's top down and party line, you can tell it from a mile off. Whereas when they kind of sit and watch and almost appropriate and then manipulate and divert to their own needs what has come up sort of organically within society, then that works a lot better. I mean, which is unsurprising.
And are they doing this through education? I mean, through schools, as well as just general sort of popular culture? I mean, how broad is it?
Yeah, they are doing it through schools, but I think, I mean, maybe this is my own bias, but I think perhaps the emphasis on school has been overdone, because there are different history textbooks even still now, and they always talk about changing this or that, or introducing some sort of indoctrination, but it never often comes to pass. They just talk about it. I think much more important is the extent to which this is in popular culture, because people choose popular culture. And I think that's what's really important, is this sense of Russian agency, in that, a lot of Russian media is not owned directly by the state. The vast majority of it isn't. And it's dependent on advertising revenues. Now, of course, the state could make it clear to advertisers that you mustn't buy advertising space with this or that channel, and they have done that. But ultimately, they still need people to watch them. They still need people to be enjoying this. So I think the interesting question again is, well, why do people start watching, and why do people keep on watching?
So this brings us on to this question about myths and memory making, which I know is your one of your 2 books coming out next year. And I was thinking about this morning because Ali and I have been talking a lot about the narratives and myths, and there's something really interesting about the debate that we're having at the moment about facts and false truths. And the problem with facts is that they require an analysis. They're not in themselves, they might raise emotions, but whereas stories and narratives, they're designed to create an emotional response, an empathetic response, and motivation. And to your research, which is in that intersection between cultural studies and now geopolitical studies, is really interesting, because that enables you then, I presume, to bring a sort of cultural understanding to how that, what you call memory diplomacy, how all of that works.
No, I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's, of course, a very pertinent one. So often what matters is not truth, but identity. So in that sense, that if we think about studies, we see, for example, of Russian propaganda, we see that if people support Putin and then they're shown state sort of or pro-Kremlin media narratives, they're much more likely to believe them, regardless of whether or not they're true. And then similarly, if they don't like Putin, they're much less likely to believe them, regardless of whether they're true. There's nothing that surprising in that, but really the lesson that it tells us is perhaps sometimes understated, which is just that a lot of it is about how one identifies, but also as well that truth is a more slippery concept than I think sometimes this focus that we have nowadays on disinformation sometimes allows for. I mean, particularly when it comes to history, there are many different ways and history is constantly being revised. But one of the things I think about a lot is there's this case, and I talk about it, I write about it, in Memory Makers, in the book that comes out sort of later next year. And it's about this idea of almost history as a form of allegorical truth. So there's a myth, a Soviet myth, the myth of the 28 Pamphilovsi, and it's about basically this group of Soviet soldiers who defended Moscow, and they sort of threw themselves. They were all sort of from different parts of the Soviet Union. They threw themselves under German tanks to help defend Moscow. It's a really touching, really moving myth. Every single Russian knows it. There's some huge monuments to it. It's people really buy into it. It's not true at all. It's been known for a long time that it's not true. In the Soviet Union, they tried to cover up the fact that it wasn't true. Brezhnev personally got involved. But then when the Soviet Union fell, everybody kind of understood. And yet now it's a really dominant myth. And the head of the Russian archives a few years back was actually fired for saying it wasn't true, even though everybody knows it isn't true. Vladimir Medinsky, who then was the Minister of Culture and is now sort of presidential aide on matters of history and memory, he funded and I think even contributed to the script of a big sort of film about the 28 Pamphilovsi. And when asked, well, this isn't true, sort of, he explained that it doesn't really matter because actually it's more true than truth.
It carries an inner truth, basically.
Exactly, yeah. Almost like a higher truth. And it sort of does, because it represents the fact that, the Soviet victory over Nazism, it was incredibly brave. It did require feats of insane individual bravery. And it was, a mixed group of people. It wasn't just sort of one nation. It was this mix of of different Soviet nations together. And so it does. And I think in the same way, it reminded me of, there was the film about Churchill a few years ago, The Darkest Hour, maybe, and he went onto the tube. And I think the director or the writer said something similar about that because obviously we all know that he didn't go on the tube. And the idea of it even is hilarious. Yeah. It's like Churchill on the tube.
I know.
But But still, and he sort of made this point that, well, it was to almost like it was almost like an allegory or a metaphor for how he did kind of try to listen to, I don't know, the ordinary man, or the voice of the ordinary man. And I find that quite interesting, because it doesn't matter until if we sit down and we're blue in the face to somebody who really loves church, or to go back to the Russia case, to somebody who the 28th Pamphilevsky myth. It doesn't matter. We can explain to we're blue in the face. Okay, this is the Anafasyev report. This is this is what Brezhnev did. This is what came out in the archives. They don't care. Then that's not why they believe it. They believe it because it tells them something about their identity, who they belong to whom they are the heirs. About their group.
And then, of course, it becomes embellished, doesn't it? On every retelling, people sort of add different dimensions to different details. Yeah. I mean, I'm very struck, and I should say this, that the parallels with some of the myths that have come out of the Iran-Iraq war, particularly your tank destroyer, people going off. So there was a narrative and a myth built about young children throwing themselves under tanks to blow up tanks. And this became a very powerful myth, these young, innocent, 12-year-olds, running off to, sacrifice themselves and martyr themselves. But of course, then after the war, people sort of said, well, we're not entirely sure it's true. But the fact is, it had been celebrated so much, and it had become such a sort of an emphatic part of the mythology of the war. And it's very striking for me, the sort of Great Patriotic War, and, what the Iranians, Suzanne and I were talking about this earlier, about this sort of single narrative and the way that it's shared among different groups, this sort of how they myth make. And of course, I think you quite rightly said, of course, we're not innocent of it ourselves, and certainly in films and other things. I think hopefully in the West, we're slightly a little bit more self-critical, although maybe I'm being optimistic there. But, there is this potential really to, as you say, it's symbolic. It's iconic of a particular thing. So they don't worry about the detail. They don't actually worry about the truth with a small t. They're obsessed with the truth with a capital T, in a sense, which for them identifies them. This is about being Russian. This is about what being Russian is. But
Ali, what's happened? I'm just interrupting you, because actually what's happened now with the Russian war on Ukraine is that myth making is now happening on the battlefield. It's happening on both sides. And I think it's obviously it's a natural consequence of a hideous war which requires great heroism, that you're seeing a lot of that, obviously also on the Ukrainian side. So a clear strengthening of Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian narratives, which is totally reinforced by extraordinary determination and military success against the odds.
But you're right. What I was saying is this reality not puncturing a hole in the myth? Did they not have this idea that obviously it was going to be a cakewalk, and now it isn't, and something's wrong with their narrative?
You definitely get the sense. Looking at polls, and of course we have to caveat that it's very difficult to do polls in a country like Russia, but they're the best we have. If you look at the polls, you can definitely see that there's that feeling that something's up. Around 80% of people now are saying that they feel, worried, concerned about the war, which is much higher than it was at the beginning. Of course, still very high numbers of support for the war. But again, we'd all say we supported the war if somebody threatened us with 15 years of prison. I'd probably support the war as well. So taking that all with sort of a pinch of salt, I think the interesting thing with the war is people have really bought into this narrative that's been around since 2014, that in power in Ukraine are full-on Nazis or banderovцы, so sort of Nazi collaborators, to all intents and purposes is the way it's used. They really believe this. And now they think that because the Kremlin had to come up with a sort of reason for why it wasn't a cakewalk, it's that, okay, there were more banderovцы than we fought, or there were more Nazi collaborators and Nazis than we fought, and also the West is arming them, and this is a civilizational war. And certainly from talking to foreign policy elites, I spoke to quite a few sort of for my book, including people who are very close to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Kremlin, and they really do believe this isn't a war for them. This isn't a war just about Ukraine. It is a war about sort of the world order and Russia's place in it. And they genuinely believe that the West is close to a real crisis that essentially means they're going to get away with this, and that we're going to move into a different type of sort of geopolitical setting, a really sort of brutally realist one, sort of the weak must suffer what they will. setup. So I think as well, understanding when we talk about the war, understanding sort of what Russians think this war is about and what war Russians are watching or reading about. That can't continue forever, of course, given the high number of losses. But I mean, it took 10 years sort of for the Soviet war in Afghanistan to start having that effect. So I don't think in the short to medium term, if we call that sort of the next sort of 1 to 3 years, we should expect that to have some sort of immediate result, though I very much hope I'm wrong.
No, and I think that is really consistent with what everybody seems to be saying at the moment, which is that there's no sign that you're going to. I think generally everyone is saying even if Putin goes, which is a possibility, but impossible to determine, you have to be careful what you wish for, because there's no sign that everybody's saying we must get rid of him and stop the war. There's every sense in which he is but one part of it. Sorry, that's what I hear people saying. But can I then move us on to this question about being Russian? Because we talked about having the myth, and this question about this conflict is about Russian identity in some way. And I think you've written both about the role of religion in sort of Russian identity, and not just sort of Orthodox Christianity, but the other official religions in Russian, but also minorities in Russia. So you have in our heads, we've all now got the idea of the sort of the heartland of Russia and the reason that Kyiv is so important in that narrative. But of course, Russia's so complicated. Does this myth appeal to everybody regardless?
No, it doesn't. That's a really interesting question that I actually wish more people asked. It really doesn't. So I looked at just one case study to kind of make this point. It's for an academic chapter that probably 4 people will ever read. But it's about how...
Welcome to the club, Jade. Welcome to the club.
But it's about how the state, the Kremlin, tries to use its sort of generic, if you can call it that, sort of all Russian narrative of the Great Patriotic War, and to apply it to Kalmykia, which is a sort of a Buddhist republic in the North Caucasus, where the entire population was deported from Kalmykia, and the Republic of Kalmykia was destroyed because a few of them had collaborated with the occupying Nazi forces. And so, of course, you think, well, how can they just try to impose that, the blanket narrative of the Great Patriotic War as heroes versus villains? But they really do. They didn't try to in any way incorporate the story of the deportations, or they just completely ignored it. So I don't think that this narrative at all has the same appeal. And I know that in certain certain minority republics in Russia, Zelensky in particular has a real sort of cult following, in particular like Tatarstan, which is...
And he did the thing at the the monument to Imam Shamil in Kyiv, didn't he? And I thought that was really interesting, because that's this direct crossover to kind of nationalist but also jihadi leader from the Caucasus, and Zelensky is talking about him.
I'm not sure how it necessarily played in Chechnya, because actually Imam Shamil has quite a complex reputation in Chechnya, but it wasn't just aimed at Chechnya. It was aimed more, it was a symbolic speech aimed at all of the peoples of the Russian Federation who are not ethnically Russian. And it's hard to know how it went down, because, most of the regimes, or the sort of like the mini Putins, the governors in charge of those regions are completely terrifying, and you can't really trust any polls. But I imagine it. I think it's very clever, and I think it's very reasonable to assume that there is separatist leanings in a lot of those republics, particularly Tatarstan. We saw that in the 90s when things were freer, or at least less easily governed. And so I think it would have gone down. I think it's a very clever idea, and I've just written a paper. Well, I'm writing it up still, on how Russia uses the narrative of colonialism, Western colonialism in Africa, and I've been thinking about to what extent Zelensky or Zelensky's team could try to almost tap into that legacy themselves, because it's very powerful. It's very powerful undermining the West, but it would be very useful if Ukraine, since they're trying this sort of, we've been colonized to, they were trying to bond over sort of shared colonization experience with nations inside Russia. It'd be interesting to see if they could shift that to nations outside Russia with no experience of the Soviet Union.
I mean, basically, is the Russian narrative really one of, obviously, of liberation? I mean, this is basically their attitude towards Western colonialism. Or, I mean, I remember going to a conference where, the Russians would talk about, their march into the Caucasus or their march through Central Asia in the 19th century, whatever. And for them, this wasn't about a sort of a imperial expansion. This was almost, they were interpreting it as a sort of a civilizing liberation. We were there to sort of bring great achievements, the achievements of civilization, to the natives, who clearly welcomed us with open arms. And it was in complete contrast, obviously, to their analysis of what the hell went on in the West. For them, the way there was a sort of a merger between the sort of the Russian and the Soviet, if I can put it that way, interpretation of what Western colonialism was. And I suppose, as you say, in relation to Ukraine, if Zelensky and others could sort of turn that argument on its head, it shouldn't be that difficult in some ways, but you would think. But at the same time, I suppose from the Russian perspective, Ukraine is just simply part of Mother Russia anyway. So, I mean, it's not an act of, it's just an act of, well, the Chinese might say reunification, isn't it? I mean, it's not an act of aggression.
No, I mean, exactly. And you're quite right in that you have this sort of sense of colonial exceptionalism, which I don't think is unique to Russia. I think you see it in sort of Turkey and sort of Japan, sort of retelling of their history as well. This idea that, no, we weren't really an empire because, and in Russia's case, it's because it was contiguous. So as opposed to sort of being overseas, like for British Empire, for example. And I mean, a lot of it is of course nonsense, and I think even the way that they sort of tell it when they start getting into these civilization, we brought them this, and I'm always like tempted to finish sentence like, did you bring them railways? Because it just reminds me so much of the UK discussions, like, what about the railways?
I know.
But yeah, I did want to come back to a point that both of you had raised, though, which is just to do with sort of Russian history and the relevance of it in this war and sort of Russian identity. Because I kept on meaning to come back to my questions and then getting sidetracked by my own thoughts, as is always the way, but about this idea of sort of historic Russia and Ukraine's role in it, if that would be okay. Just because,
sure. I
mean, even when on his eve of war speech, or his morning of the war speech, just before he launched the invasion, sort of Putin references this idea that he's invading to protect Russia's historical future, which I find just a really unusual, obviously it's quite an unusual phrase. And so I've been thinking about it quite a lot. And I was thinking about, okay, sure, Russia thinks that sort of Ukraine is part of Russia, but I think it's deeper than that. I think it's about the idea that Ukraine's entire sort of different understanding of itself. Without Ukraine, Russia doesn't work. It's not just that Russia isn't an empire without Ukraine in the sort of famous phrase. It's that Russia's understanding of its own, or the Kremlin's sort of the view of Russian identity that the Kremlin is promoting, it just doesn't work. So if you think that, I mean, there's a very essentialist understanding of identity there, but if we say that essence is this idea of this kind of historic Russia, this third Rome, based on orthodoxy, with gathering all the lands of Rus, if we say that establishes Russia's right to behave as a sort of a great power with its own special path of development, like anti-West or against the West, a sort of state civilization has this sort of messianism, that's broadly the sort of view of the world and view of Russia that the Kremlin espouses. But without Ukraine, that essence evaporates. You can't really be a great power if you can't control your smaller neighbor, or you can't conquer a city that's sort of 40 kilometers from your border. Doesn't really work. And you can't convince, you don't have this great sort of messianic role if you can't convince even ethnic Russians who are Russian speakers to join you in cultural communion. You have to bomb them. It just doesn't work. And so I think it'd be very, very hard for Russia to ever accept that this war has failed, because we see all the time this idea that, like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that, without Russia, Ukraine doesn't have any history. But I think it's actually the opposite. Without Ukraine, the Kremlin's understanding of Russian history, and it's not just the Kremlin's, it's in most of Russian society today, that doesn't exist. Almost their Russia doesn't exist without Ukraine, rather than vice versa, which is why I don't think it ends, simply with, okay, you can have her son and then we'll all just get on with our lives.
But it's curious, isn't it? Because you can choose. It comes back to the whole question about memory making and memory diplomacy. You can actually choose what you want your memory to be. And I suppose the unfortunate fact is that the memory that they've chosen, the story they've chosen to tell, is dependent on Ukraine being part of Russia. They could have chosen to tell a story from the beginning which wasn't dependent on Ukraine being a part of Russia, but because they have done, they're sort of hostage now.
Yes, well, I think I agree that it's definitely a choice, but I also think it's to do with how they understand the nation. So they have this very primordial sense of like, there are some nations are nations and some aren't. Almost that there are sovereign nations and there are non-sovereign, and there are colonies, in the words of Putin earlier this year. And as opposed to that sort of more constructivist vision of a nation as something, a country that comes together around shared bonds, because there isn't really much that can bond the Russian nation together. It's ethnically very diverse, religiously diverse. There's no ideology. There's no, obviously, civic. You're not going to do well with much sort of civic identity. Building it around that at the moment. And you can't do ethno-nationalists because, of course, then it would all, then sort of lots of, it just wouldn't work because it's so diverse.
It is remarkable, isn't it, as you say, the paradox there, that they've relied on a very, very sort of vulgar, primordial understanding of the nation. Mm-hmm. Because, frankly, they can't really build it on any other, they can't construct it. So they've relapsed into this, it just is. It's a natural existence, and this is what it is. And you lot are all part of it, whether you like it or not, type of thing.
Yes, exactly. And ironically, I actually think this was like an evolution from trying to construct it, because I think what Putin originally realized was that the only thing that really bonds the Russian people is a shared view of history, and particularly the memory of the Great Patriotic War. And then as this kind of obsession with history went further and further, the idea that history is not just, a politically useful tool, which of course it is, but that it's actually, the real essence of Russian identity, rather than just what they were using to create a Russian identity, seemed to somehow become very embedded. And it's almost, there's a lovely Russian phrase that sort of Putin sort of sung himself to sleep with his own lullabies. And you do, he drank his own Kool-Aid.
He certainly did.
In less evasive American terms.
I mean, the other thing which, we have strong parallels is this idea that, of course, as the war in Ukraine goes wrong, and the Ukrainians don't suddenly embrace their fraternal allies, in a sense, or their brothers in arms. Of course, the war is being defined as a war against NATO or a war against, the United States. So if they do lose, they're not losing, to the Ukrainians. They're using to this vast sort of international conspiracy, effectively.
To the Anglo-Saxons, actually.
And precisely. Absolutely. And
again, it's a historical term, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
That doesn't who are the Anglo-Saxons nowadays, when Britain and America have incredibly diverse populations, actually. So I find even that is fascinating.
Yeah, it's a myth. It's a myth on a myth, isn't it? I mean, you're just, and you see this, as I said, Iran is very common with that. I mean, we didn't lose the war against Iraq. We lost the war against America, who backed Iraq. That's the thing. And it was an international conspiracy against us. So in that way, going back to what Suzanne was saying about, sort of a rational interpretation or a myth, in a sense, you're never going to have your reckoning. You can just reinterpret the myth in a slightly different way and keep going on it. We weren't defeated by the Ukrainians, by this comedian, the president, we were defeated by something much, much bigger. If actually they even accept they were defeated, actually. I mean, that's the other thing. It could they could turn it into some sort of great triumph of sacrifice or something. I don't know, but.
Yeah, no, it's true. I remember once getting into sort of like this proper debate with some 14-year-old in Russia about who won the Crimean War. And then in the end, I was like, I don't care. I actually don't care who won the Crimean War. Why am I having this discussion? But yeah.
And does religion play a role? So you did raise this point about the use of religion, but to what extent are they using, the religion and Russian Orthodoxy to somehow embellish this narrative?
I think the Russian Orthodox Church is playing a really important role in legitimizing the myth, and also in this sort of rhetoric that we're hearing increasingly of the sort of de-Satanization of Ukraine, and which sounds completely ridiculous, but it's being pronounced by people who were once considered serious sort of politicians.
Did Medvedev say that? Yeah,
he did. And I think it's really important, because I know there was a bit of annoyance when the UK government in the summer, I think it was in July, sanctioned Patriarch Kirill. But really, this is somebody who's really is encouraging, terrible, if not genocidal actions against Ukrainians. So it's not appropriate to see him as some sort of religious figure. He is an incredibly political figure, and he's played a really important role in legitimizing it, sadly.
Jade, we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to ask you a sort of swerve sideways question and ask about your role as an academic who studied Russia, starting with studying the language and the literature, moving into, trying to understand the country as a geopolitical actor. But as somebody who clearly loves the language and literature and teaches Russian culture, this war presents an enormous challenge, doesn't it? Because Russian culture is now, as we've just been discussing, essentially being questioned on all sorts of fronts. So where does it leave the study of Russia and the study of Russian literature? And has it fundamentally changed the study of Russian culture by people in the West?
I don't know. I hope it does in some ways. But firstly, I hope it reinvigorates it, because clearly I think the approach where you just study countries as if they were all the same, and you don't have that sort of area knowledge, has been shown as unhelpful. However, also going too far the other way, where you just focus on Russia without seeing it in context. I think one thing that would be helpful is, say, for me, I always have studied other Slavic languages, and when I realised that, when I started my PhD, I also picked up Ukrainian so that I could understand the Ukrainian perspectives of this, because I realised it was going to be really, really important to be able to read that firsthand. But I would say that I've been a bit surprised by the shock of some Russianists over this war. I mean, don't get me wrong, I of course also was shocked and horrified by this war, and it's a complete different, level in terms of scale. But a lot of the things that some people went through, I think I went through in 2014, particularly with the downing of MH17. I found that really shocking. And I remember I had friends who, were trying to justify it one day and then trying to say it was a lie the other day. And I found it really distressing, to be honest with you. I lost probably, I'd say, 90% of my Russian friends over the war in Ukraine. And I think you can probably even hear now, like, it's not in my voice, like it's not like a happy time to remember. And I always thought that I would live in Russia or at least between the two countries, UK and Russia, for most of my life. And obviously that was another shift, and we returned home in 2015. So this idea that, like, where on earth did this come from is a bit, went from Russianists, not from ordinary people, but from Russianists. Sometimes it annoys me a bit, because I think, well, there were bodies lying in sunflower fields that, Russia didn't do anything to allow, children's bodies to be picked up. I don't understand why you're so shocked, let alone as well, without getting into all of the other stuff, the awful stuff it was doing in Syria, and then of course the Skripals here.
Yeah. I mean, so those of us who've worked in the British government, if you're going to sanction the use of, radiological chemical weapons in the UK, you are already on a different path. And I think it's obscene, geopolitical judgments that seem to, we'll just take them in our stride, but it's not normal behaviour.
No,
really.
Yeah.
So, but in terms of, I mean, it's really difficult, presumably, for students now studying Russian, because they can't go to Russia, or because people, and that's going to have a long-term impact on the discipline, isn't it?
It's going to have a huge impact, and that's one of the things that I've been doing in my job at Middlebury, was to set up sort of virtual. Maybe next year it will be in Armenia, but we'll see. But to make sure that that Russianists, so Western students, like graduate students of Russia, are still able to connect with Russian voices. And that's been really a difficult one as well, because you don't want to in any way legitimize people who are pro-war. But ultimately, if you don't have young Russianists listening and able to sort of question and argue with Russians who are, I'm not talking about like the real sort of genocide inciting ones, but people maybe like Dmitry Trenin, who is sort of come to accept the war out of some sort of place of loyalty. If they can't even handle speaking or hearing from Dmitry Trenin, then what hope do they have actually ever understanding Russia? Because Dmitry Trenin is ridiculously moderate for the Russian context. And that's a really difficult situation, because in this atmosphere, of course, and I understand, I also sometimes find it, I also often find it very difficult to speak to people who are trying to explain away, the fact that their country is bombing, the houses of people who are my friends, places where I've lived. So it's, of course, it's personal as well. But you have to do that. You have to have that empathy so you can understand the other side, not because you should like them, because you should sympathize with them or indulge it, but just because there's nothing genetic about Russians that makes them like evil or support this war. This will happen again, and it's just really important to sort of start to unpick the myths, understand how they work, so we can argue better against them.
I think that's a really good note to end on, because that is what Ali and I are trying to do.
There are sadly so many parallels, Jade. So many parallels of what you have said.
Ali. We don't have time.
I know, but there are so many. And well, at least I'm pleased to hear that you are facing many of the same difficulties and questions that I've had to also face over the last decade vis-a-vis Iran. But I thought that was great. I think we're going to round it up now, are we? I don't know, Suzanne. You don't look as if you have another question. Do you have another question?
No, we can't. We've finished.
We've
run out of time.
Thank you.
We are saying thank you.
Thank you, Jade.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
That was brilliant, and hopefully we'll be able to call on you again. Perhaps nearer the time when your book is coming, when your books come out. But that was great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's goodbye from me
and me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we'll see you next time.